Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Valley. My name is Jacob Berman, and I'm joined today by Derreck Bennett. Derreck Bennett is the author of Addictus, A Non-Believer's Path to Recovery, and he also is published in the Journal of Higher Criticism. Um, he was once a mythicist, but now he's a historicist.
Hmm.
So today we're going to be asking him a few questions. What led up to him becoming a historicist? What was his journey? All right. So that's my first question. What was the thought process? What was your first thoughts that led up to you becoming a historicist? What caused you to doubt and believing in the idea that Jesus did not exist as a historical figure?
Well, I should say that technically I'm agnostic
Okay.
on the historicity of Jesus. I don't know for certain, and I certainly don't claim to know,
Right.
but it's all a matter of probability, right? So I think more and more I just find Jesus' historicity to be more probable given
Given
a
the
right
evidence.
approach to the evidence, right? But that doesn't mean that I know this for certain, and I don't think that mythicists are crazy. I do not. Uh, but I would say I think for the longest time, I've been studying this stuff independently for about 15 years. And for the longest time, I think Jesus's historicity was something that I just more or less took for granted. I just more or less assumed, even reading Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier, I was with these guys on a lot of their major points, but I still thought a historical Jesus was probable. And then when Carrier came out with On the Historicity of Jesus, and I read that, that gave me pause to consider that perhaps Josephus had never actually mentioned Jesus at all. And so then I really began to entertain mythicism, and I even blogged about it, and that more or less became my position. And of course, never one to leave any point or of debate or issue closed. I'm always open-minded. I read other opinions on the matter. I listened to Bart Ehrman's debate with Robert M. Price. I read um, Tim O'Neill and his responses to Richard Carrier. I know mythicists hate him, but I had to give him a fair hearing. And I thought some of his points were really on point, and that led me to doubt some of the assertions that Carrier makes. And I more or less decided that a proper approach to the evidence, and particularly to Josephus, um, more or less led to the conclusion that a historical Jesus is actually more probable. And there are other reasons beyond that as well, but that's kind of a major point in all of this, anyway.
Right. I myself had issues with Dr. Carrier's argument regarding James. The way the James passage is presented now was some kind of accidental copyist interpolation. I don't really see how something like that could have been an accident, even if it did occur. Um, and Origin mentioning Jesus, who was the brother, to James, who was the brother of Jesus, called the Christ. There's past tense language there. That means Josephus discussed him being the acclaimed Christ prior to that passage. Even though Origin may not have quoted the testimonium directly, it means via the past tense language that the testimonium, some form of it, did exist before the one Eusebius interpolated into Josephus. Because the way we have it now, the big problem that we have it written now is that the way it is presented to us makes it look like that Josephus did accept Jesus as the Christ when the original one did not. And Origen discussed that. He was angry at Josephus because it's Josephus who did not believe Jesus was the Christ. He talked about that over and over again. And against Celsus in his commentary on Matthew. And the stronger case to be made is that there was an original authentic testimonium Flavianum, Antiquities 1833. It at least mentioned his crucifixion, that he was claimed to have been the Christ and nothing more, and that James was his brother. Because also Jesus, son of Damnius, he was that's the one that Dr. Carrier claims is the real brother of James. Uh,
Mm.
it just doesn't make any sense to me because that Jesus was removed from the high priesthood very quickly. Like he only was in charge for like, if I remember correctly, 3 months, from what Josephus Flavius said. He didn't last very long. He was removed on 63 CE, just about, because he there was some technical issues with him not following the Torah to the letter, and he got removed from the priesthood. And James was pro-Torah, explicitly pro-Torah. He was killed by Ananias, who wasn't pro-Torah. He was against circumcision. So that's just a bit odd that he would be the brother of somebody that is against the Torah. And this is the same James that argued against Paul in Galatians. So the ideologies didn't fit either. There's just too many complications with it, in my view.
Yeah, you're digging right into the real nuts and bolts of this. It's the Testimonium Flavianum. I could see that potentially being a wholesale forgery, and I'm not saying I'm convinced that it is.
Right.
Again, that's something else that I'm more or less agnostic about. It does seem to stick out like a sore thumb in the context of the preceding and following passages. But who knows? Josephus, as I understand it, was prone to such things. But it's the James reference that I think is sort of ground zero for all of this.
Yes.
And I, if you take the passage about James in Josephus and you try to say, okay, this was Jesus, son of Damnius, well, he introduces him in the text as we have it now. They brought James and some others. James, who was the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. If you try to switch that up and say, well, originally it referred to son of Damnius, well, then he's introducing him as son of Damnius, and then he's concluding with son of Damnius. And as Tim O'Neill points out, Josephus just never does this. And even if you try to say, well, maybe he had originally said something like Jesus, who was high priest, and he's referring to the same James, son of Damnius, well, then he's introducing him with one qualifier and ending with a different qualifier, which is, again, something that Josephus just doesn't typically do. It really, it's more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's simpler. It's in science, and when we use Occam's razor, I'm totally brain farting the word parsimonious. There it is. It's more parsimonious if we just assume it was written as it stands. And then, of course, one of the other things that Carrier says is that Josephus would never use the word Christ without referencing what that word meant. But as Tim O'Neill shows, Josephus does use obscure references and titles for others without giving any kind of explanation as to what that meant. So that's just not true either. Don't get me wrong, I love Richard Carrier. I have learned immensely from him. I'm not trying to dog him out, and I say this partly out of fear that he doesn't wind up catching wind of this and thrashing me online. But I'm a big fan of Richard Carrier. I think he's great. It's you can still have great regard for people, as I do Price, whom I consider a friend, and not entirely disagree and not entirely agree with them on every single point. So, and then of course there's Origin, as you discussed, and Carrier says that one of the biggest arguments against the authenticity of the James passage is that Origin never mentions it. Well, how can that be? When Origin he's saying Josephus's discussion of James, though he did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, he can only be getting this from Josephus. Carey argues that he's recalling Hegesippus on this point, and he probably is partially. Partially, this is coming from Hegesippus, another author, but it must also be coming from Josephus as well. I think there's something of a he's not recalling it perfectly. He knows he's read Hegesippus and he's read Josephus on this point as well, so he's partially remembering both, and he does seem to recall that Josephus had mentioned him but didn't regard him as the Christ. Now, that just doesn't make any sense at all unless he read Josephus mentioning Jesus but not regarding him as the Christ. Hegesippus was a Christian, so he wasn't reading Hegesippus on that point.
Exactly.
And then, of course, who knows? Origen is writing in the 3rd century. Josephus wrote this stuff toward the end of the 1st century, after 90 CE or thereabouts. So maybe there was an interpolation in that interim, but that's pure speculation. The evidence, as we have it, as it stands, seems to suggest that such a passage was there in Josephus, and Origen had read it.
Exactly. And another issue that I have with the arguments in general with regarding Jesus being mythical, completely mythical from the starting point, is that Paul wouldn't give a Davidic genealogy to somebody that was mythical in Romans 1. Um, and there's no clear example of a crucified angel or God in the cosmos, but crucifixions were commonplace in the 1st century CE among Jewish rebels that were being put down by the Romans. Now, Paul does seem to tap dance on what he mean on the exact meaning of the crucifixion in his letters, like why he was crucified by the rulers of the age or be executed on earth. The way he wrote it is a bit strange, I admit, but um, nonetheless, crucifixions were commonplace on earth in the 1st century CE, and that's something that I do have a problem with when it comes to saying, okay, so Paul didn't believe in a historical Jesus at all. And what doesn't help is he argued with James in Galatians. The same James, again, like you said earlier, the James passage in Josephus is ground zero. It is ground zero because it also ties in with the Galatians argument. James being the brother of the Lord and James being the brother of Jesus who was called Christ is very similar. Very similar titles, very similar phraseologies. It kind of ties them in together in such a way one could conclude that based on the evidence as we have it, it's more probable than not that James did have a brother called Jesus that was crucified during the 30 CE, during the reign of Pilate.
Yeah, I think so. The other thing that has me leaning more toward historicity is an argument that Christopher Hitchens, of all people, made, which is that you see this business about his being Jesus of Nazareth, but they've got to get him to come from Bethlehem per the ancient Hebrew prophecy, right? So that
Right.
he's a descendant of David and whatever. So you can tell that they had to do some reworking of things, and that seems to be something of a hint that we might have an authentic Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the way in which mythicists respond to this is by saying, well, actually, he was more or less known as Jesus the Nazarene, and they invented him as a Nazarene for theological purposes. I find that to be a strange response. It seems more likely to me that he simply was a Nazarene than that they had. I mean, what theological reason would there be for inventing him as a Nazarene? I suppose it's possible, but again, the more parsimonious explanation here is that he simply was a Nazarene. And then perhaps that became, misconstrued as his having been from Nazareth. And then you've got the whole problem of, oh gosh, now we've got to get him to hail from Bethlehem. So let's create this whole bogus consensus, or bogus census, mind you, with Caesar Augustus and whatnot.
Right.
But yeah, I think the whole Nazarene business, it it just seems more, why invent him as a Nazarene and create that problem for yourself to where, oh, now we've got to do some more reworking to get him to be from Bethlehem. No, the simpler explanation is that he simply was a Nazarene. That is the far more parsimonious explanation. So that's another point that I think is in favor of historicity.
Same here. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of issues that does favor historicity. Going back to the Galatians argument again, when Paul has that argument with James about following the Torah, um, it looks like early Christians were in conflict between um, Torah believing Jews that were um, later somewhat blended in with Christians because they believed in Jesus, but in a different way than the early Christians believed in Jesus. So that could easily have culminated together to form what could be called Jewish Christianity.
Mhm.
Um, and in the Gospels, there are attempts to amalgamate multiple Christianities, different beliefs, and that's why they also include multiple deliberate contradictions about Jesus,
Mhm.
not just mistakes written over time after copying, copying. Uh, like Jesus being at one point pro taxation, against taxation in different places in the Gospels. Sometimes he's pro Roman, sometimes he's not. Uh, Sometimes he says arm yourself, sometimes he says sell your clothes to buy swords. I mean, and in other places he'll say turn the other cheek. It, it's like it's amalgamating different viewpoints into and attributing them to the Jesus character, harmonizing different ways that different Christians believe. I mean, because we also do know that there were pro-circumcision Christians. There were also anti-circumcision Christians. That's like, okay, so we'll follow the Torah to a certain point, and then you have other Christians that say we don't follow the Torah at all. It's disregarded. It's the old covenant, which is what became the primary belief system of modern Christianity. Is that most of them believe that disregard the old one.
Yeah, and I follow Robert M. Price in realizing that, um, you know, if we grant that there was a historical Jesus, it seems we can know very little about him. I mean, who's to say that any of that
I
stuff in
agree.
red ink in the New Testament is something that he said? It's more than likely something that was fictively placed on his lips in order to serve the purpose of whichever Christian community was writing at that time. And that's why you have such contradictions. That's why you have, I mean, Paul is basically preaching a Torah-free gospel. Hey,
Exactly.
it's not about it's not about following every tot and jittle, or jot and tittle, excuse
John and
me,
Tittle.
of
Yeah.
the law. It's about faith. It's about faith through or grace through faith through grace. I'm totally brain farting the actual terminology
Oh,
here.
it's all good.
Faith through God's grace, who
Yes.
sent Christ to die on the cross for us. And here we have Jesus in Matthew's gospel saying, "Whoa, hold on just a minute. No, not a tot or jittle of the law shall pass until she'll fade away until everything is passed, until everything is done, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees. You won't even have a place in heaven." So this is more of a Torah observant Jew who's writing this. Who's to say what Jesus did say or didn't say? I
Right.
very seriously doubt that we have any kind of um,
Sayings of
orally
Jesus. Yeah.
transmitted, carefully. Yeah, I don't think we really have that. I think Carrier actually cited Gerard Ludemann as arguing that the apostle Paul seems to have known very little about Jesus. And even Bart Ehrman teaches in his classes when he has his students write down on a 3x5 card everything that Paul knew biographically about Jesus. It ain't much. So I think
Right.
Ludemann argued that Paul knew very little about Jesus, but at least knew of such a person. And
Right.
that's about the extent of it, whom he considered historical.
I agree completely. I, when I look into the historical Jesus, I don't really look at the Gospels for anything. It's too late. It's just too harmonizing. There's too many harmonizing going on in the Gospels. Too many inventions. Too many fictionalizations. Quotes attributed to Jesus they didn't say. All that we can know with near certainty near certainty, based on the evidence that we currently have, is that James had a brother called Jesus that was crucified at some point during Pilate's 10-year reign. That's it. There's not a whole lot else we can say
About it.
about it.
Yeah.
Everything else is mythologization. And that's why I've been saying lately that if you look at Paul's letters, when you look at the pseudepigraphical Pauline epistles, and then look at the Gospels in that order, you can tell that Jesus is being mythologized over a long period of time. They're adding Jesus is a high priest now in Hebrews, and then Mark tries to defend that assertion by adding Mary and Martha to the Gospel. Mary and Martha were based on the sisters of one of the Jesuses that Josephus mentioned. They're discussing the Talmud, Mary and Martha Bophus. And Professor Eisman mentioned that. So, so Mark is trying to defend the idea that Jesus is a high priest while reconciling it with the Jesus that died in the 30s. So to depict all that work, you got to get him to rise from the dead in the 30s. That way he can be alive and witness the Jewish revolt in the 60s and be that high priestly guy discussed in Hebrews. And then you add in Mary and Martha. And you have a bunch of chronological reconciliations going on, just as an Acts, it flips Judas and Theudas over. So Theudas is before Judas, when in fact it was the other way around. Theudas was in the 40s, Judas was in the early CE 10s. So um, you have all these anachronisms being forced, wedged into the story of Jesus' life. Like Joseph Arimathea taking down Jesus from the cross, huge Schoenfield back in 1965. He's the earliest author that I could tell, that I know of. I mean, that mentioned Joseph Arimathea paralleling Josephus taking down the three men from the cross. These are on 70. These are all characters that were added to the Gospels to play a part in Jesus' mythologized life.
Yeah, no argument there. I mean, the Gospels are just,
Right.
they're hagiographies almost. They
Yeah.
are historical fiction. I mean, that's if do I really need to make any sophisticated scholarly arguments here? If you can't tell that just by reading them, what the hell? Seriously.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the other thing, Jacob, that makes a lot of sense to me is the cognitive dissonance theory of Christian origins, where it just makes the most sense that there was a historical Jesus, some messianic hopeful, that he was martyred, killed on a cross, and that is what catalyzed the whole movement. It's
Yeah.
precisely, I mean, look at various cults and the way that they operate. Look at what happens when what is expected doesn't come about. Do they stop in their tracks and cease to exist? No, they double down. They rationalize something all new, and they carry on. The Mormons have done this. Jehovah's Witnesses have done this. The Millerites, who became the Seventh Day Adventist Church, they predicted the end.
Absolutely.
The day came and passed. They're still with us today because they rationalized some two-bit piece of theological crap that,
Hmm.
this seems to be exactly the kind of thing that happened with early Christianity. I think this guy was martyred, perhaps put to death on a cross under Pontius Pilate, and because they had placed so much hope in him, they couldn't simply let it go at that. How did the resurrection faith begin? There are multiple explanations of this, and yes, any naturalistic explanation is more probable than an actual resurrection. I'm sorry, apologists, but you're just
Hmm.
you're not fooling anyone but yourselves on this matter. It could have been mere rumors. Someone's having said, hey, I saw so and so, I saw Jesus, or so and so saw him. Oh, really? Or perhaps it was bereavement visions of some sort, or who knows? But we know that this is part of the human condition, that things like this happen. And Robert M. Price wrote a great, um, it's included in his book, Jesus is Dead, called The Origin of the Resurrection, how they might have initially have reasoned that Jesus would soon return with the general resurrection of the dead. That this was imminent, it was coming, and Jesus would return then along with everyone else. And perhaps that morphed over time into he already had been raised. Yeah, he's already been raised. He's been exalted. He's ascended to heaven, and he'll be back. With a second coming. There are so many different ideas you can play with that just they seem altogether plausible in terms of what we know from human psychology, sociology, cognitive dissonance reduction, and so that's what makes the most sense to me is this cognitive dissonance theory of Christian origins, wherein you did have a messianic, hopeful Jesus who was martyred. Sure, there are alternative mythicist explanations as to how it all began, but I think this one makes the most sense.
I agree. It does. It does make the most sense.
Again, it's all about what is most parsimonious. And if
Right.
we're big fans of the scientific method and Occam's razor and,
Right.
and going with the simplest explanation, I'm afraid this is kind of the way you have to go.
Right.
Now, I do want to say that I have I have conflicting views when it comes to mythicism, in that I recognize that there is a stripe of mythicists that is overzealous, that has practically become its own kind of crazy fringe cult or religion. Um, there it is. But I do not want to paint all mythicists with the same broad brush. I have friends who are mythicists whom I have great regard for them. I love them to death. A mere disagreement is not cause for me to have any kind of to burn any bridges. I think of my friend Kristen Whitaker Hood, love her to death, been very supportive of my work over these years, and just a great individual. David Fitzgerald, I love David Fitzgerald. I know there's one historicist in particular, I won't mention his name, who said in a thread at one point, he said, "I will not speak to David Fitzgerald." What? He's one of the nicest, funniest guys you could meet. I love David Fitzgerald. So, and of course, Carrier, as I mentioned, I love Richard Carrier. So I'm not trying to create enemies here. This is not me wanting to shit on the mythicists. I think that we can agree to disagree, and
Right.
I've learned tremendously from these people, and I'm not trying to dog them out. That said, there are some who are just like, dude, you're get it together, man. This is it's you've got too much of your identity and your emotions tied up in this. Relax, But that's not all of them.
Right. Yep. So, is there anything else that's on your mind? Or is that pretty much it? That pretty much covers it.
I think that pretty well covers it. I
Okay.
mean, I think, if there's any way in which you could say that I'm still a mythicist, it's that even if I think there might have been a historical man behind the curtain, however obscure he is now,
The New
we can
Testament
still say that the Jesus Christ of the New Testament is a
is
myth.
fictional. Yeah,
It
I agree.
absolutely. So you could say I'm a mythicist in that regard, and I think I'm completely on the same playing field with all the other mythicists, at least as it concerns that. I've
Everybody,
spent years studying comparative religion. Go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, I was just saying I've spent years studying comparative religion and the various pagan parallels with
Right.
Christianity, and you can tell that these claims about him, that they are garden variety stuff for that
Right.
day and age. Looking at other figures like Apollonius, Romulus, Osiris, Aristeas, Asclepius, I could go on and on. you see very similar stories, not identical, mind you, but very similar, and that it's all kind of cut from the same cloth. If you regard those as mythical, then you've got to say the same about Jesus, or else it's just special pleading.
Right. And what I was gonna say earlier is that everybody is a mythicist when it comes to New Testament Jesus existing as described by the New Testament. That's for sure. That person did not exist.
Yeah,
Yep.
agreed.
All right. I think that just about cuts it. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think this is great. This I will probably be a good jumping board for further dialogue. Hopefully, everyone's kind.
Right.
And yeah, that about wraps it up. I'm always still as Price always says, my conclusions are tentative and provisional, so I remain open-minded. Perhaps I can be convinced otherwise, but
Same
that
here.
is where I stand right now.
Same here.
Yep.
All right. Thank you for joining me. And remember, everyone, this is the History Valley. Don't forget to subscribe to it. Check out the Patreon if you wish to donate to support this channel. And don't forget to comment if you have any questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Share this with your friends. Discuss it. And I'll see all of you later. Thank you for watching.